So let's talk about the difference between gearing your resistances in Path of Exile as opposed to gearing your resistances in Last Epoch. So I made a video a long time ago, and I'm going to pull up Notepad right now and give you a brief overview of, not Notepad, but Paint. Give you a brief overview of how resistances work in Path of Exile, because it's wicked interesting, okay? Let's go dark mode, perfect. And let's bring up, how about green? Green's a nice color. In Path of Exile, you have 75 res by default, and you can raise your maximum resistances. And a question that people often have in Path of Exile is, why is it so good to have plus maximum resistance? So the way that I like to explain it is this. Your res is increasingly important in PoE as you approach the maximum resistance. If you can imagine having 100% resistance in Path of Exile, you would take 0 damage, right? So the difference between having, 99 res, 99 fire resistance, and 100 fire res is that you go from taking 0 damage to taking, 1,000,000,000 damage, right? Or let's say 1,000 damage, okay? So now you're going to take 1,000 damage from this. That's an M. If you go from 99 to 98% resistance, and again, this is theoretical, but we're just kind of laying the groundwork for what I want to explain to you. If you go from 99 to 98% resistance, you are doubling the amount of damage you take, right? So you're going to go to like 2,000 damage here, right? And then if you go to 97, you'll have to do the math on your own time, but you're going to take, 50% increased damage from there? Maybe like, 2,500 or something like that. But the point is, as you stack plus maximum resistance on your gear, on your character in Path of Exile, the amount of damage that you're mitigating is stronger and stronger and stronger. As you move from 75 maximum resistance to 76 maximum resistance, you are mitigating a bit of damage. But then every time that you continue to invest in that, each additional investment that you make in plus maximum resistance in Path of Exile is increasingly strong. It's increasingly good at mitigating elemental damage in PoE. Let's move to Last Epoch real quick, right? Whoa, dark mode. Let's move to Last Epoch. There's an important line of text here that might not immediately come to your attention. There's not much hidden information in Last Epoch, but this is like, it's a little tiny little bit of hidden. So let's talk about it. This says, enemies penetrate 1% resistance per area level up to 75%. The penetration applies after the resistance cap, so extra resistance above 75 has no effect unless enemies shred your resistance. Resistance can be brought below 0 to make you take increased damage. The most important thing here is that enemies by default always penetrate 75% resistance. So in PoE, in Path of Exile, you would never want to go below 75% resistance, because for every 1% that you're going below there, because plus maximum resistance is increasingly strong, you're going to take a ton of damage. Even being like 70 or 71% resistance instead of 75 fire resistance in Path of Exile, you're taking a lot of damage, and you don't want to do that. However, in Path of Exile, if you're sitting at 0% fire res, and then all of a sudden you move to -1% fire res, it doesn't really matter. This is not a big deal to go from 0 fire res in Path of Exile to -1 fire res in Path of Exile. Remember this graph that I'm drawing over here, and I can make a more precise graph if you really want to, but the point is, you're increasingly strong against fire resistance the more resistance you have. But if you only have, 0% res right here, and you're moving to -1 res instead, it is not nearly as drastic a change on the y-axis here as this 1% drop that's illustrated in this top box up here, right? Which is interesting, because by default, enemies in Last Epoch penetrate 75% resistance, which means that in Last Epoch, you're at 0% resistance all the time, whereas in Path of Exile, you're at 75% resistance all the time. So you are starting at a different point along the curve, which means that in Last Epoch, even if you're playing in hardcore, if you're only at 74 or 73 or 72 cold res, it's really not that big a deal. If you can get a big chunk of, maybe crit avoidance on your gear, or a big chunk of 12% increased maximum life on your helmet, if you can get a suffix like that, instead of worrying about moving from 74 to 75 res, it can oftentimes be worthwhile because of where these two games put you as a different starting point along the curve. PoE being up here, or Last Epoch being down here. Now, there is shred in Last Epoch, so like you probably want to be about 100 all res in this game in order to mitigate things like maybe shred, or maybe things like marked for death. It's like a curse debuff that any enemies place on you. It appears a lot more often in empowered monoliths, but it happens in normal monoliths as well. So, shooting for 100 res is pretty good. But if you only have 75 or 74 or 73, 72, that is not a sin in Last Epoch the way that it would be in Path of Exile. So there's been a lot of things that we talked about over the past couple days about like how the penetration or Fizz taken as elemental in Path of Exile, or necrotic taken as Fizz, things like that, like the reverse receiving damage element in Last Epoch. It's been really cool talking about and learning about all the intricacies of what's worthwhile, what's worth stacking, what's not worth stacking, what's my armor doing, how good is it for me to have nodes or things like things that say this, like lightning damage taken as physical damage. How good are these things? It's been honestly enjoyable. But I wanted to make this short video here just talking about the resistances here and talking about the resistances in Path of Exile, because in PoE, it's hard for a new player to jump in and learn these things because there's such a burden of knowledge of like all these past leagues over the past 10 years, and then all the mechanics and intricacies of your specific build. And really in Last Epoch, there's not that much hidden information, specifically because there's an in-game guide where you can just type things in and learn. But I wanted to talk about this because I found it as an interesting comparison between the defensive foundations of these games, and I hope you like it too.